Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar focusing on COVID-19 and Canadian and US immigration developments. Today we're joined by Managing Partners Stephen Green, Evan Green, and US Practice Director Tim Golden. The panelists will save some time at the end of the webinar to answer your questions, so please feel free to ask some questions in the text box provided on screen. If we do not get to your question, you can reach out to us directly at info@gons.com or email the addresses provided on screen. If you are a current client of ours, please reach out to your lawyer directly. I'd also like to encourage you all to follow us on social media and sign up to our alerts where we provide the latest immigration updates and breaking news. And with that, I'll hand things over to our panelists.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I hope everyone is well. We are starting our 5th week of this, and we seem to have some more clarity on some of the issues, but things are changing. We got an update on Friday, believe it or not. On Good Friday, the government came up with an update. And for those of you who haven't seen Steve and I or Tim before, this must come as quite a shock to you as what we look like. But before we started this, Stephen had a brush cut. I was completely dark, and Tim looks the same. So with that, let's talk about some of the issues and what we're seeing and some of the changes that have occurred. So Stephen, let's talk about what we're seeing at the border now in terms of, first, let's talk about family members. Okay. What are we seeing the government is doing with family members of Canadian citizens with permanent residence?
Sure. So it's important to understand that, as Evan indicated, on April the 9th, the government issued more direction, attempted to clarify some things, and that direction is good for 20 days. So from April 9th to April the 29th, the government has issued new directions. And generally what they've stated from a processing standpoint is that anyone who had filed their application prior to any of these instructions being issued, their application is kind of on hold unless you can demonstrate that your work permit is essential, that you fall into one of the exemptions as a visitor who can come. So those are pretty much on hold. And the reason that is so is because the government is trying to put their resources towards the urgent matters, or, as Evan made small mention of, this concept of essential matters. So what has happened is that there are lots of directions given by various departments. The Immigration Department has given some direction, the border people, the CBSA people has given some direction, and also the people responsible for the quarantining of people that come to Canada. And it seems there that the quarantine requirements are being interpreted by the border officers in some circumstances, we believe, in a very restrictive way. So it's important to understand that based on the Quarantine Act and the CBSA officers, you must demonstrate that your requirement of being in Canada, despite the fact that you met things with immigration and you're exempt from this and you're allowed to come in, that you are also able to enter based on this concept of essential services. And you should know that the federal government of Canada, as well as all the provinces, have issued a list of what they consider essential services. So an example would be, I got my work permit from the embassy abroad. I identify to the airline that I'm flying in, here is my approved work permit. Then I arrive in Canada, then I must meet the border officer, and that border officer is responsible for applying the Quarantine Act, and I have to prove to that officer that my services on the work permit are essential. And again, that border officer will most likely go to the essential services list that has been provided by the federal government and all the provinces and look to see, are you an essential service? So I think, Evan, that's really one of the biggest things that we've seen from our last webinar to now, is that these border officers are really, in some respects, interpreting this Quarantine Act quite, strictly.
Yeah. So when we're talking about people traveling, we can't stress enough. If you have people traveling, you got to get the most up-to-date advice and travel packets to show that the individuals do qualify for entry. So okay, let's take it, we're going to divide it into 3. So I'm a Canadian citizen or permanent resident. I want to bring my family member from the US to Canada. Can I do that, Stephen?
Okay, so the question becomes, first of all, then they haven't changed this, is what is an immediate family member? And we've talked about, immediate family member of a Canadian or a permanent resident immigrant would be their spouse, common law partner, same-sex partner, would be their dependent children.
I meet that.
Sorry?
I meet that. Okay,
so
I'm a common law partner. We've been living together for 5 years. Now,
right.
How do I get my common law
up
partner?
Until a week or so ago, we would tell that particular person, show up if you're flying in with your marriage certificate or your, to prove that you are a family member of an immigrant or of a Canadian citizen in Canada. Show that to the airline. You would then be permitted to board because you meet the definition of immediate family members. You would come to the border. The officer would generally let you in. But now what we're seeing is that this concept of family members being reunified with Canadians or permanent residents that are in Canada, they want to make sure that it's not just a sort of a visiting reunification. You don't want to be in. Sorry?
Riding out the storm. They don't want people riding out the storm.
So you as an immediate family member can't be coming to Canada to ride out the storm. You can't say, well, I've lived in the United States, my Canadian, husband has come to Canada and now we're coming there to join him. And if you don't have an answer, well, to the question that the border officer says, well, how long are you staying for? What are your plans? Is it permanent? You can run into difficulty and actually be denied entry because you don't have the intent to live in Canada. It was a riding the storm situation.
I think our best advice there is you want to file an application for that spouse to come to Canada first, so you can show that you have a permanent intent to come back to Canada.
Right. And we've had people, it was interesting. We had somebody who was coming with his wife, who was an American citizen, and he was a Canadian, and they had a child. They let the Canadian, and they told the wife and the child, well, you are just riding out the storm, as Evan says, and they sent them back.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about workers and what we're seeing with workers. So you talked about essential services. If I got a new contract in Ontario, I'm opening a distribution center for food, okay? Essential service. How am I supposed to make that work permit, okay? Can I do that at the border? What do you suggest there, Stephen?
Well, the release on April the 9th by the government indicated that, for example, you're an American citizen and you meet the criteria to get a work permit, be it under the free trade agreement, be it under any type of normal immigration criteria. You can apply at the border for that work permit. And if you were coming to Ontario, for example, you would indicate to the border service officer that, please refer to the list of essential workplaces issued by the Ontario government. You will see that on their essential list, there is a designation called food, and that involves pretty much anything dealing with supermarkets, convenience stores, restaurant takeout only, beer and wine stores. Then you should be eligible to enter Canada. And if you are coming with your immediate family, there could be a little issue though, because Evan can maybe talk about an example where there was a husband and wife. The wife had a work permit. The husband was coming as an immediate family member, and Evan, tell them what happened.
So the story is, it has more to do with the way the wording of these proclamations are. It's family reunification. That's key. That's what they agree, that they can reunite families. So what happened to us, and what we say to people is that if you're coming together as a family, then you're not reunifying. In our case, we had an individual who they had approvals, okay? So the principal applicant was the wife. She was approved for a work permit, getting her first work permit, fine. The spouse, the husband, was coming as a visitor, okay? And got through the first gatekeeper, who's the ticket agent, and they said, fine, go on the plane, you're good. Got to CBSA upon landing and said, we have no authority to allow you in because you're not reuniting. You're actually together. And they sent him back. We had to apply, and there's as part of the regulations, you apply for a special permit for family reunification. Even though you have an approval, it's a secondary approval, and you apply for it either at the consulate, or they say that there's an inland number that you get a response in 48 hours. We're finding it slower. Our best advice is apply to the consulate. So yesterday we applied to the consulate. Yesterday we got the approval, and the spouse who was sent back on Saturday arrived last night. So don't ask me why, but it has to be family reunification. Best advice going forward, the principal comes on day one, apply, showing the principal is here, has the work permit. 3 days later, you get the approval. The rest of the family comes.
Right. So the way it stands right now then is that you really can't fly together as a family, and the main applicant has to enter first.
Yeah, you might be okay. We've had other ones that were okay, but the way the guidance read that was issued at the end of last week, you must apply separately for that.
Right. So, and I will remind everyone as well that, remember, okay, so you were able to get, past the first gatekeeper, the airline, then you got to the CBSA officer and was satisfied, yes, you're an essential service. We're going to issue the work permit, but before we issue the work permit, we also have to look at the Quarantine Act that we're responsible for managing, and that Quarantine Act states that you have to quarantine for 14 days, and therefore you must have a proper plan to express to the officer, and the government now has created a new document that you must complete at land borders or at the airport called the coronavirus form. And on that coronavirus form, you give your basic data information, name, date of birth. They want to know what airport you are at or land crossing. They want to know the full address and contact information of where you will be staying for the 2 weeks, be it a hotel, be it a home. And then they will ask you for an email, your mobile phone, a landline.
Bottom line, they're checking in. They're not saying, you promised to quarantine for 14 days. This is much more than that. This is, yes, we're checking in to make sure that you do what you are required to do under the Quarantine Act. So obviously, they've stepped that up for sure. And if you don't show up with a quarantine plan, you can be refused entry for that.
Right. And also, if you violate the plan that you've expressed, you can be fined significantly under the act. So, you know, the government, again, it's, you know, they've moved really fast. And now they're, you know, they've had time to look at their policies, how they're going to implement things. So understand now that, you know, more and more strict guidelines are being imposed on people that are coming in.
Okay, we want to give Tim some time, but before we do that, we want to talk a little bit about students and what's happening with students. Stephen, you want to talk about that?
Well, basically, what's occurred with students, you know, nothing has really changed. If you applied before March 18th and you've got your student visa, before that, you're fine. Anything after that, you're kind of on hold. The question becomes, you know, how can I start my course or come to Canada and start to study in June for my summer semester when the schools are closed? And the government has looked at various, you know, scenarios online, and they've talked about a certain percentage of your course can be online and then you can come after. So again, the student situation is quite fluid. You must apply online for your student visa to come to Canada. Again, students are going to find it difficult in certain parts of the world to complete their biometrics, to complete their medicals. So a lot of things are on hold, and we're going to have to see when these, you know, centers open up where students can get their biometrics, where they can complete their medicals, and again, of course, also the ability to get here with so many airlines limiting the ability to enter Canada.
Okay, let's switch directions and head over to south of the border. And Tim, do you want to update us a little bit on what's going on south of the border?
Of course. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining the webinar. Thanks for the intro. Sorry?
Tell us what's going on going south.
Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't have as many details for the, I think, sort of piggyback on the essential versus non-essential discussion. Canada has really entered into very defined and really sort of drawn out the rubrics under which individuals are considered essential versus non-essential. I would say the general non-essential are visitors to the United States. If you don't have any sort of business-based reason to be in the United States, then there is no basis for you to be visiting, to go for family, etc. I think there are some capacities under medical issues. If you have a medical issue that potentially may be needed to be treated exclusively within the United States. But again, it just comes down to a very nebulous definition of essential versus non-essential. And I would say my conversations with the border over the course of the last, few weeks during this was kind of an adamant determination about that essentiality, but now has sort of walked it back a little bit. And, my discussions with different ports of entry, but, the standard being, if there's work down there that needs you, then we're going to consider it. But exactly what Stephen and Evan said, you've got to be able to sort of view each entry and see what's going to be needed. What is that justification that you're going to be able to present? And that's applicable for people with work authorization that's already been approved. That's applicable for individuals who are going in as visitors, business visitors, distinction from visitor for pleasure, and after sales service, the type of things that Evan and Stephen were talking about that are also inclusive. And that I think is the real standard. And then the other thing that some people may be somewhat shocked by is that they're still processing applications for Canadians, for TNs, for L1s, intercompany transfers. Obviously, everybody has sort of dialed back a lot of operations. So the justification again has to come, and this is a quote from a border official: if the lights are on in the US, then we'll consider it, we'll assess it. So coming to the border, and exactly what Stephen and Evan said, specifics about why you're essential. I think that's the guidance for going south of the border into the United States. We bounce a little bit on the agenda, just going back to item 6. I think that's now the evidence of what we've been talking about the last few weeks are really 3 outlets for US immigration: consulates, the border, and USCIS. Consulates are closed except for extreme situations right now, both for US citizen services as well as non-immigrant visas and immigrant visas. The border, as I just said, limited. So USCIS is really sort of bearing a lot of this burden. And that is, as a result, USCIS has made some concessions, has had to dial back some things, one of which is they are, and this is a big relief, they're allowing for scanned signatures. Electronic signatures can go into USCIS. It was always for most applications, a wet signature required. So that's a benefit. The disadvantage is, one of the benefits is premium processing, where you can expedite an application. Because they're so burdened, they can't, they've suspended premium processing until further notice. Some of the other aspects of USCIS, which are bad and good in some ways, are all of the local field offices where Evan and Steve were talking about biometrics, similar point of contact for biometrics within the United States. Those are closed through April and it looks like into May as well. And those are closed, so that puts a real sort of stop on a lot of applications that require biometrics. But USCIS, again, has come out and debuted that they will use for renewals, they'll use old biometrics. So that's a concession that's been made. And I think the lesson to come from that is, not to dwell on the same point, but USCIS is leaving the lights on. They are shifting to a work from home model. They've been in that for a couple of weeks. But in reality, I think the conclusion that we can take away from it is, when you're looking for a solution, USCIS may be the real best destination for you in all the varied, because they really have, they have to continue. And I think because, they're keeping the lights on, they're adapting to a lot of these things. We're going to see likely the consulates sort of slowly come back. The border, that essentiality, non-essential aspects, probably going to be something to be dealt with as well as that expands. But USCIS, as I said, bearing the burden. So one that you should look to as definitely an option for US immigration matters. So then continuing on that, I think just going sort of anecdotally, and a lot of what the calls have been coming in from clients and people who are interested in big issues. I think one that a lot of people have been calling about is, hey, Tim, what about this public charge aspect? And public charge, as those of you who know, this administration has come out and, almost coincidentally, I would say, to this tragedy, to this crisis, is they rolled these out to say, if you're taking any sort of public benefits, Medicaid is sort of the focus, welfare, but then others which are listed within the request and are part of new applications and extensions, is there is a mention of unemployment insurance. But luckily, they have come back out and clarified three very important points. One is about unemployment insurance. Unemployment insurance is not a public benefit, and they're pretty clear on that. And there will not be a penalty for claiming unemployment within the United States, because that's something that you pay into, somewhat like Social Security from another standpoint. The other is, they've said that Medicaid, using Medicaid to go in and get testing, that is not going to be seen as something that you have to disclose or cannot be explained under the public charge assessment. And then finally, small business loans. Those are something that they will not determine to be under a public charge because of the way it's been sort of configured. So those are things that hopefully give some relief to those people who are on the ground in the United States, potentially having to look to those three different types of public assistance, quote unquote. And then another thing, talking about calls that are coming in, I think one that's really been developed and is interesting is the working remotely for individuals. A lot of Canadian nationals saying, well, I work in the United States, but I'm going to come up, I'm going to hunker down here for a little bit and do that work remotely. Now that's okay. There's no immigration on the internet. You are a Canadian citizen. You're in your home country doing work remotely. But the thing to keep in mind are as your status expires, whether it be an H, whether it be H-1B has its own sort of positioning and location issues. But if that's coming up for expiration, you've really got to make a concerted effort with your company to determine, how are we going to get this extension? Is it going to be at the border? Is it going to be internally within the United States? And if so, for I-9 issues, which means that you're on a U.S. Payroll and they have to have valid status for you if they're going to continue to pay from the U.S. As a result, if your status is expiring, then you, could really be presenting a compliance issue. So that's definitely something you want to check in with your HR if you're working remotely. And then also touching on sort of final point before we go to question, our students. Students, as Evan and Stephen touched on, obviously it's a big issue, but they've made concessions there as well, allowing for people to go home, to study remotely essentially. But I think there, which is somewhat to the I-9 issue, speaking with HR, if you're a student and you are back home in Canada taking classes online and you're taking a hiatus, you've got to stay in constant contact with your foreign student office. It's a very insular relationship. It's not something that a law firm can step in and sort of rectify it. It's about really understanding and being in accord with the movements from your foreign student office, making sure if there's going to be extensions and need for you to present an updated I-20 at the border, confirmation of continuing enrollment, you've really got to look to your foreign student office. But that's as we're coming up with about 4 minutes to go, I guess we can reserve the rest.
Yeah, we'll start on some questions. So one of the questions that I was asked was somebody's in the United States and they want to come back now and they have a valid work permit. So Stephen, what would your recommendation be? What do they need to do?
Well, again, they've met the first criteria is they have a valid work permit. 2, is it an essential job that they'll be doing? They're going to have to demonstrate that. Certainly demonstrate that the employee-employer relationship still exists, and that they have a quarantine.
You got to prove that for sure, that the job still exists.
Yeah, the job has to exist. You can't come back without a job.
And you got a 14-day quarantine plan.
Correct.
Right. Yeah, that's it. So next question I have. Well, when can a student come in for the first time? Stephen, you addressed that already. You either have to have an approval that's issued prior to March 18th. If you don't have anything that's issued prior to March 18th, you can't enter, period. So you can apply now, but the regs have to change before you will be allowed to enter, okay? Hope you are keeping well. Do you think the mother of a minor Canadian national enter with her son to Canada? Well, if they're both Canadian citizens, they have a right to enter the country. There's no issue there, but 14-day quarantine plan, okay?
And it's interesting, the Prime Minister has indicated today, I believe, that if you don't have a proper quarantine plan as a Canadian, they will then place you in their quarantine residence that they've established in various hotels across the country.
I mean, most of the questions that we're getting asked is, how long is this going to take? How long is this going to take? How long is this going to take? The bottom line in all the questions like that is, right now, in terms of the guidance that they came out with last week, the government is prioritizing certain applications, and that's for their first line responders, wherever they be, whether they be medical, whether they be food service, that's what's getting priority now. Everything else is sort of being put to the side. That's not to say that things aren't being processed. They are, okay? We are seeing things, but things are taking a lot longer. For example, we're filing work permits and we're getting the request to do biometrics. Well, you can't do biometrics other than in China and some other smaller centers, okay? There's no place in North America to do biometrics. So those things are going to take longer, and the government recognized that, because automatically you used to have 30 days to do biometrics. Now all the biometrics, they're telling you 90 days you have to complete them. But things are being processed. PR is being processed. There was 2 draws last week. PR cards are being processed, but you can just expect things to take longer with what's going on. Stephen?
No, I mean, you pretty much answered all that. I don't have much to add, and just that understand that delay, and that's why it's so important to start any application as soon as possible, so you're not in a situation where you don't have a document, you may lose your health care, your driver's license may expire where you need your document. So again, really plan far out to apply for any type of document.
Where our advice for extensions is 6 months. you should be applying, because we don't know once they open up biometrics how they're going to do it, right? If they're going to do it based on the date that you got your biometric request or not, we don't know. But there's certainly going to be a backlog there for sure. Bottom line here, everybody, if you've got people traveling, get in touch with your council beforehand to make sure you have the most up-to-date information. Things are changing daily, and we want to make sure that we have the most success that we can getting your essential workers back. We are open for business and available to answer your questions. So thanks everyone for your time today and for attending. And most importantly, keep safe.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.